Princess Ilara, the rightful heir to the throne, had always lived under the watchful eye of her stepmother, Queen Serafina. From the moment Serafina married the king, she made it clear that Ilara was nothing more than an obstacle in her pursuit of power. Though the queen treated her with outward politeness in public behind closed doors, she never missed a chance to remind Ilara of her place. Serafina was a woman of noble lineage, obsessed with bloodlines and status, and she believed that commoners were beneath the royal family. To her, they were merely tools to be used for labor, taxes, and war. Despite the queen's oppressive presence, Ilara had always found solace in sneaking beyond the castle walls, wandering through the bustling streets of the village, disguised as a commoner. It was in one of these stolen moments of freedom that she met Alden. Unlike the nobles who surrounded her at court, Alden was not concerned with power or wealth. He was a simple villager who worked as a blacksmith's apprentice, but there was something about him that set him apart. He carried himself with quiet strength, his words filled with wisdom far beyond his humble origins. Ilara was drawn to his kindness, to the way he treated people with respect, regardless of their status. At first, she had only visited the village to escape the suffocating rules of the palace, but as the weeks turned to months, her visits became about something more. She and Alden would sit by the river, talking for hours, sharing their dreams of a better world. He spoke of justice, of how a ruler should care for the people, not exploit them. His ideals resonated with her, and before she knew it, she had fallen in love. Their love, however, was forbidden. The kingdom's laws were clear. Royalty could not marry commoners. A princess was expected to wed a nobleman, someone with wealth and power who could strengthen the royal bloodline. If anyone discovered the truth, Ilara could be disowned, or worse, executed for treason. Yet love was not something she could simply ignore. Defying the rules of the court, Ilara and Alden exchanged vows in secret, promising to stand by each other no matter the cost. There was no grand wedding, no royal celebration, just the two of them beneath the stars, pledging their hearts to one another. Ilara had never felt more free than in that moment, but she knew the dangers they faced. She kept her marriage a secret, playing the role of the obedient princess within the palace walls. Queen Serafina remained unaware, continuing to plan a future for Ilara that involved a politically advantageous marriage to a nobleman of her choosing. What the queen did not know, however, was that the man she sought to control had already pledged herself to someone far greater than any noble. Someone who, though poor in wealth, was rich in courage, wisdom, and honor. Alden, though just a common man in the eyes of the court, carried within him a strength that even kings would envy. And soon, the kingdom would come to learn that true power was not defined by gold or titles, but by the heart of a man willing to fight for what was right. Queen Serafina had always been a woman of ambition, her hunger for power greater than any love she had ever possessed. With the king growing weaker by the day, she saw an opportunity to seize complete control of the kingdom. However, there was one obstacle standing in her way: Princess Ilara. As the rightful heir, Ilara's claim to the throne was undeniable. The people adored her, and her presence alone threatened Serafina's grip on power. For years, the queen had played the role of a dutiful wife and stepmother. But behind the facade, she had been carefully weaving a plan to eliminate Ilara from the line of succession. Her first step was to ensure that the princess married someone of her choosing, someone who would serve as a pawn rather than a partner. Serafina had already found the perfect candidate, Warlord Vicar, a brutal and merciless man feared across the land. Vicar was no nobleman. He was a conqueror, a war-hardened tyrant who had built his power through bloodshed. Unlike the soft-spoken nobles of the court, he commanded vast armies of ruthless soldiers, men who swore loyalty not to a crown, but to the force of his will. Serafina knew that if she secured a marriage between Ilara and Vicar, she could use his strength to eliminate any opposition. Once the princess was bound to him, her claim to the throne would be meaningless, and Serafina could rule without question. While the queen continued to manipulate the court, Alden remained in the shadows, unaware of the immediate danger closing in on him and Alara. However, fate had a way of revealing secrets. One evening, while delivering supplies to the castle under the guise of a servant, Alden overheard a group of nobles in hushed conversation. At first, their words seemed like idle gossip, but as he listened, his blood ran cold. A foreign kingdom was preparing to invade. Their forces were growing stronger, and their spies had already infiltrated the land. Worse still, Queen Seraphina was refusing to act. It was clear that she was more concerned with securing her power than protecting the kingdom. If something was not done soon, the land would fall, and thousands would perish. Alden knew he had to warn Alara, but time was running out. With the Queen's schemes in motion and war looming on the horizon, he realized that their secret marriage was not the only thing at risk. The fate of the entire kingdom now rested in his hands. The once great kingdom was now a shadow of its former self. The king, a ruler known for his wisdom and fairness, had fallen gravely ill, his condition worsening with each passing day. The royal healers could find no cure, and whispers of poison spread through the castle corridors like wildfire. Though no one dared to accuse Queen Seraphina outright, many suspected that she had a hand in his decline. With the king too weak to rule, she wasted no time in assuming control. Under Seraphina's rule, the kingdom descended into chaos. She dismissed the king's most trusted advisors, replacing them with those loyal to her alone. Any voices of opposition were silenced, either through exile or sudden, unexplained disappearances. While the nobles feasted in the palace, the common people suffered. Taxes were raised to fund Seraphina's lavish court, leaving villagers struggling to afford even a loaf of bread. Many were forced to sell their lands, while others resorted to theft just to survive. Beyond the palace walls, the streets of the capital were filled with tension. Once busy markets now echoed with the cries of starving children. Blacksmiths, tailors, and merchants who once thrived found their businesses failing under the weight of heavy levies. The Queen's guards patrolled the streets, ensuring that no one spoke against her rule. The kingdom, once united, was beginning to fracture. Rumors of war spread like wildfire, igniting fear in the hearts of the people. Scouts and travelers spoke of foreign warships gathering along the coast, of enemy soldiers marching closer with every day. And yet, the Queen did nothing. She dismissed the warnings as exaggerations, unwilling to spend resources on military preparations. Some whispered that she was too blinded by her own schemes to see the danger at her doorstep, while others feared that she had already struck a secret deal with the enemy. Deep within the castle, Princess Alara watched helplessly as her people suffered. She longed to intervene, but she knew that her stepmother would see any defiance as an act of treason. She had to be careful, had to act in secrecy. Meanwhile, Alden, moving unseen among the villagers, saw the suffering firsthand. He knew that if something was not done soon, the kingdom would not survive. War was coming, and if the Queen refused to protect the people, then Alden would have to do it himself. As the kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse, Alden refused to stand by and watch innocent people suffer. Disguised as an ordinary villager, he moved through the streets, offering what little aid he could. He gathered food for the starving, patched up injured laborers, and helped those who had lost everything find shelter. His kindness did not go unnoticed. Among the desperate and downtrodden, whispers began to spread of a mysterious man who stood against the cruelty of the Queen's rule. To the nobles, he was insignificant, a mere commoner, but to the people, he was their only hope. One evening, beneath the cover of darkness, Alara slipped away from the palace to meet Alden in their usual hiding place, a small, abandoned cottage at the edge of the forest. She had heard of the Queen's latest orders. Any man or woman found speaking against the crown would be arrested, and any signs of rebellion would be met with swift execution. She feared that Alden's actions, though noble, would draw too much attention. When she arrived, she found him deep in thought, studying maps and worn-out scrolls by candlelight. It was then that he finally revealed a part of himself that he had never shared before. Alden was no ordinary villager. He had been trained from a young age by an exiled war general, General Kyle, a man once revered as the kingdom's greatest military mind before being banished by the Queen. Under Kyle's guidance, Alden had learned the art of strategy, combat, and warfare. Though he had never fought in battle himself, he possessed knowledge that could rival the most experienced commanders. Alara was stunned. She had always known there was something different about Alden, something beyond his kind heart and sharp mind. Now, she understood why. His past, though hidden, had shaped him into someone far greater than the Queen could ever imagine. But with this revelation came greater danger. If Serafina discovered the truth, if she learned that Alden was not only defying her rule but was also capable of leading a rebellion, she would have him executed without hesitation. Alara pleaded with him to leave the kingdom, to flee before it was too late. But Alden refused. He would not abandon the people. He would not abandon her. "The Queen may sit on the throne," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "But she does not own this kingdom. The people do, and I will not let her destroy it." The sound of heavy boots and clanking armor echoed through the palace courtyard as Warlord Vicar and his army arrived at the castle gates. His soldiers, hardened men who had seen countless battles, stood like a wall of steel and brutality, their presence alone enough to strike fear into the hearts of those who witnessed them. Vicar himself was a towering figure, his face marked with scars from wars long past. His reputation preceded him, a conqueror, a tyrant, and a man who valued power above all else. Queen Serafina, draped in her finest royal attire, met him in the grand hall, surrounded by her most loyal advisors. She had summoned Vicar for one reason: to secure her rule. With the king's health failing and the kingdom on the brink of war, she needed a strong force to crush any opposition, both within and outside the kingdom. In exchange for his loyalty and protection against the foreign invaders threatening their lands, she was prepared to offer him marriage to Princess Alara and, eventually, a share in ruling the kingdom. Vicar, however, was not a man easily manipulated. He listened to the Queen's proposal with a smirk, his cold eyes scanning the lavish throne room. He saw weakness, a desperate ruler clinging to power. To him, Serafina was nothing more than a stepping stone to his own ambitions. While she believed she could use him, he had already devised a plan to turn the tables on her. "I will protect your kingdom," Vicar declared, his deep voice filling the hall. "But protection comes at a price. When the war is won, I will not be a mere prince consort. I will take my place as king." Serafina hesitated. She had intended to use Vicar as a tool, not hand him the throne. But the threat of invasion loomed large, and she was running out of options. She knew the nobles would never support her outright rule without the king, and if she refused Vicar's offer, she would be left defenseless. Meanwhile, hidden among the palace servants, Alden listened intently. His worst fears were coming true. Serafina was willing to sell Alara's future to a warlord to keep her own power intact. And worse, he could see the hunger in Vicar's eyes. This was not a man who would share power. This was a man who would take everything. Time was running out. If Alden and Alara didn't act soon, the kingdom would fall into the hands of a ruthless conqueror, and there would be no saving it. As the kingdom trembled under the weight of war and oppression, Alden knew that waiting any longer would only seal their fate. If Queen Serafina would not protect her people, and Warlord Vicar sought only to claim the throne for himself, then it was up to him to fight for the kingdom's survival. Moving through the villages and hidden camps in the forests, Alden gathered those who had been cast aside: starving farmers, displaced families, outlawed mercenaries, and exiled soldiers. At first, many doubted him. How could a poor man, a simple villager, lead them against powerful armies? But as Alden spoke, his words ignited something in them, a fire that had long been extinguished by years of suffering. "We fight not for gold, not for crowns, but for our homes, for our families. The Queen has abandoned us, and the Warlord seeks to rule us. But this kingdom does not belong to them. It belongs to us." His speech spread through the land, carried by whispers and hopeful hearts. The people began to see him as more than just a commoner. They saw a leader, a warrior willing to stand for them when no one else would. And so they followed him. Using the knowledge he had gained from the exiled war general who raised him, Alden began training them in guerrilla warfare. He knew they could never face an army head-on, but they didn't have to. Instead, they would use the land to their advantage, strike from the shadows, ambush enemy supply lines, weaken their forces before the real battle even began. The exiled soldiers, once branded as traitors, became Alden's captains. They passed on their knowledge of swordplay and archery to farmers and merchants who had never held a weapon before. The outlaws, who had spent years hiding in the wilderness, taught them how to move unseen, to set traps, and to use deception against their enemies. Day by day, Alden's army grew stronger. The once hopeless villagers now stood with newfound confidence, their hands gripping weapons not as tools of survival, but as symbols of resistance. Word of their movement reached every corner of the kingdom. The people no longer looked to the queen for salvation. They looked to Alden, the poor man who had risen to become their true leader. It was only a matter of time before Queen Seraphina learned the truth. Though she had been focused on securing her alliance with Warlord Vicar, whispers of rebellion had begun to reach the palace. The villagers spoke of a leader who had risen from among them, a man uniting the people against tyranny. Seraphina, believing herself untouchable, dismissed these rumors at first. But when her spies returned with more troubling news, she realized this was no ordinary revolt. The leader of the rebellion was Alden, the very man her stepdaughter, Princess Alara, had secretly married. The revelation sent a wave of fury through her. The idea that a mere commoner had dared to wed into the royal bloodline was an insult beyond measure. Worse still, it meant that Alara had been defying her all along, playing the obedient princess while secretly binding herself to the enemy. Seraphina wasted no time. She summoned her most trusted guards and issued a single order. Alden was to be found and executed immediately. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Alara had no idea that their secret had been exposed. She had been trying to find a way to warn Alden about Vicar's growing influence, when suddenly, guards stormed into her chambers. "You are under arrest, Your Highness," one of them declared coldly. Alara's blood ran cold. "On what grounds?" The captain of the guard stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Treason." Before she could resist, iron shackles were fastened around her wrists. She struggled, pleading with the guards, but it was no use. Her stepmother had already passed judgment. Dragged through the palace halls, she was thrown into the cold depths of the dungeon. As the heavy cell door slammed shut, realization sank in. Seraphina would never let her go. Not alive. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, Alden was still leading the people, unaware of the danger closing in. If Seraphina's soldiers found him first, he would not be given a trial. He would be executed before he ever knew what had happened to Alara. Queen Seraphina believed she had everything under control. With Alden marked for execution and Alara locked away, she turned to Warlord Vicar, convinced that their alliance would secure her rule. She promised him full military power, gold, and the hand of the princess, once Alara was broken into obedience. But Seraphina had underestimated Vicar's ambition. The warlord had never intended to share the kingdom. The moment his forces were firmly within the castle walls, he struck. His men turned on the royal guards, cutting them down before they could react. The queen's most loyal advisors were slain in the throne room, their pleas for mercy drowned in the clash of steel. Seraphina, for all her cunning, had not foreseen betrayal so soon. As she tried to flee, Vicar's soldiers surrounded her. "You were useful," he said with a smirk, "but I don't share power." Before she could protest, she was thrown into the very dungeons where she had imprisoned Alara. The irony was not lost on her as the heavy iron doors slammed shut, trapping her in darkness. Above, Chaos consumed the castle. Vicar, wasting no time, declared himself the new king, his banner replacing the royal crest. To make his claim absolute, he ordered the castle to be burned, sending a message to anyone who dared challenge his rule. Flames licked at the stone walls, smoke rising high into the sky, a symbol of the kingdom's fall. But hope was not lost. Far from the burning castle, Alden had escaped his execution. With the help of loyal villagers and disguised sympathizers within the palace, he had slipped through the queen's grasp before her soldiers could carry out her orders. Now, as news of Vicar's betrayal spread, he knew the time to fight had come. Standing before his gathered army, farmers, blacksmiths, exiled warriors, and outlaws alike, Alden raised his sword. The queen has fallen. A tyrant sits on the throne. But this is our kingdom, not his, not theirs, ours. The crowd erupted in cheers, their fear replaced by unyielding determination. The battle for the kingdom had begun, and Alden was ready to lead them into war. The kingdom had suffered under oppression for too long, first under Queen Seraphina's greed, and now under Warlord Vicar's ruthless rule. But the people had reached their breaking point. As news spread that the queen had been betrayed and the castle was burning, hope ignited in the hearts of the villagers. And at the center of it all stood Alden, the poor man who had become their leader, armed with whatever they could find, farm tools, hunting bows, stolen weapons. The people rallied behind Alden. They were not trained soldiers, but they had something Vicar's army did not: the will to fight for their homes, their families, and their freedom. Alden, knowing they could not win through sheer numbers, used clever tactics and guerrilla warfare. His soldiers moved swiftly through the villages and forests, setting traps, ambushing supply routes, and cutting off Vicar's forces before they could fully establish their rule. What Vicar thought would be an easy conquest turned into a nightmare of endless resistance. By the time the warlord realized what was happening, his forces were dwindling. Alden's army took back one village after another, forcing Vicar's men into retreat. The people, once too afraid to speak against the crown, now rose up in rebellion, striking from the shadows, poisoning enemy rations, and turning the kingdom into a battleground where every street, every alley, and every farm was against Vicar. Meanwhile, deep in the palace dungeons, Queen Seraphina sat in chains, powerless for the first time in her life. She had ruled with an iron fist, believing herself untouchable. Now, the very warlord she had trusted had cast her aside like a broken pawn. For the first time, she knew true fear. When she heard of Alden's rebellion, she sent for him, begging for his help. She swore that if he freed her, she would restore his name, offer him wealth, even acknowledge his marriage to Alara. But Alden only stared at her coldly. "You caused this," he said. "You let this kingdom rot while you chase power. Now, you can watch as the people take back what's theirs." With that, he turned away, leaving the woman who once ruled the kingdom with cruelty to rot in the very prison she had built for others. The people's uprising had begun, and there would be no mercy for tyrants. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the final confrontation loomed. Smoke from the burning castle still hung in the air, mixing with the sounds of clashing steel and battle cries. Alden's forces, once mere villagers and outcasts, had pushed Vicar's army to the brink of defeat. The warlord's men, demoralized and exhausted, began to falter, but Vicar himself stood defiant, unwilling to surrender. Realizing that the battle could be decided with one final clash, Alden stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the morning light. "Face me, Vicar," he called. "End this with honor, if you have any left." The warlord smirked, gripping his massive battle axe. "A poor man dares to challenge a king," he mocked. "Fine, let's end this." The battlefield fell silent as the two men circled each other, warriors from both sides watching with bated breath. Alden, the strategist, studied Vicar's movements, searching for weaknesses. Vicar, a brute forged in war, relied on sheer strength and power. The fight began with a furious exchange, Vicar's heavy swings forcing Alden to dodge and weave, barely avoiding death with each step. The warlord was stronger, but Alden was faster. He used his agility to land quick strikes, cutting Vicar's armor and drawing blood. But Vicar was relentless. He slammed his axe down, nearly shattering Alden's sword. A powerful kick sent Alden sprawling to the ground, the warlord raising his weapon for the killing blow. A moment of silence. Then Alden rolled away just in time, grabbing a fallen dagger from the dirt. As Vicar swung again, Alden dodged and drove the dagger deep into the warlord's chest. Vicar staggered, eyes wide in shock. He tried to strike again, but his strength faded. With one final push, Alden swung his sword and ended the warlord's reign with a single decisive strike. The battlefield stood still. Vicar was dead. His soldiers, seeing their leader fall, dropped their weapons in surrender. Alden, breathing heavily, looked around at his people, the villagers, the rebels, the warriors who had fought for freedom. And then, slowly, a cheer rose, spreading across the battlefield like wildfire. The tyrant was gone. The kingdom was theirs once more. As the battlefield quieted and the kingdom reclaimed its freedom, whispers of Alden's true identity began to spread. Though he had fought as a commoner, as a man of the people, there was something about him, his knowledge, his leadership, his skill in battle, that hinted at a past greater than he had ever admitted. At last, standing before the gathered people, Alden chose to reveal the truth. "I was not always a poor man," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I was born into a noble house long forgotten, House Everwind, once loyal to the crown, before it was destroyed in the shadows of corruption." Gasps rippled through the crowd. House Everwind had been erased from history, its lands seized, its people scattered. Few even remembered its name. "My parents were betrayed and slaughtered when I was just a child," Alden continued. "Those loyal to our family hid me among the villagers, where I learned to live as one of them. I was raised in hardship, but it was among the poor that I found kindness, courage, and a purpose greater than wealth or titles." Elara, standing at his side, took his hand, pride shining in her eyes. "I never wanted power," Alden said, looking at the people before him. "I fought not as a noble, but as one of you, and that is who I will always be." The people did not see him as a lord or a prince. They saw him as their leader, their protector, the man who had fought for them when no one else would. And though he carried noble blood, his heart would forever belong to the people. As the kingdom celebrated its newfound freedom, the people gathered in the palace courtyard, their voices united in a single demand: Alden must be their king. He had proven himself not by birthright, but by action, leading them when no one else would, fighting for the weak, and bringing down the tyrants who had sought to rule over them. To them, there was no one more worthy to wear the crown. But Alden hesitated. "I did not fight for a throne," he said, looking over the sea of hopeful faces. "I fought so that no one else would suffer under unjust rule. Power was never my goal." Yet the people would not waver. "Who else but you?" they cried. "You are the only ruler we trust." Alden turned to Elara, the woman he had fought to protect, the woman he had loved in secret for so long. He had never sought power, but if he was to lead, he would not do it alone. "I will accept," he said at last, "but only if Elara rules beside me. Together, we will build a kingdom where no man, rich or poor, is ever forgotten, where no voice goes unheard." Elara stepped forward, taking his hand, tears of pride in her eyes. "And together, we shall keep that promise." The people erupted into cheers, for they knew this was not the beginning of another dynasty of greed. This was the dawn of a new era. And so, in the ashes of tyranny, Alden and Elara rose as rulers, not by birth, but by the will of the people. The day of judgment came not with a sword, but with a decree. Queen Seraphina, once the most powerful woman in the kingdom, now stood before the very people she had oppressed. Stripped of her title, her wealth, and the fear that once kept her untouchable, she was no longer a queen, only a woman facing the consequences of her cruelty. Alden and Alara stood before her, side by side, their rule now cemented by the will of the people. Many had called for Seraphina's execution, but Alden refused. "She will not die a martyr," he declared. "She will live among the very people she ignored, without the riches she hoarded." And so, Queen Seraphina was exiled, sent to the poorest villages where once she had turned a blind eye to suffering. No longer dressed in silk, no longer waited upon, she was forced to survive as one of the commoners she had despised. Meanwhile, under Alden and Alara's reign, the kingdom flourished. Laws were rewritten, ensuring that the voices of the poor, the workers, and the forgotten carried as much weight as those of the nobles. No man would ever again be denied his worth because of his birth. As years passed, the legend of Alden, the poor man who saved the kingdom, became a story told for generations. His name was sung in the streets, written in books, and remembered not as a king, but as a hero. For in the end, it was not gold or noble blood that saved the kingdom. It was the heart of a common man, willing to fight for what was right.